Okay, you are recording.
All right, so welcome to the February 22nd meeting of NUWARI. This is an open meeting of the NUWARI Working Group being held consistently with Governor Baker's executive order from March 12, 2020, due to the current state of emergency in the Commonwealth. All members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely, and so we are doing that. We are ensuring public access to the meeting so that the public can follow along with our deliberations. This meeting will not feature public comment, and we always note that the meetings are being recorded. So with that, I want to say welcome to everybody. Good to see you again. A couple of things I think for where we can start. We last met on February 8th and we approved a draft version of our vision and some of our guiding principles, and we forwarded those to the select board. The select board took them up the next night and they were unanimously approved by the select board. Yay, yay. So now we're actually back again, hoping that we can have a follow-on conversation about our guiding principles. With a goal maybe of finishing a couple more and then being ready to send them out to all the committees. So we've kind of held sending them to the committees, thinking that maybe we could wrap up a couple more. You'll remember we thought we might be able to do a couple more last time, and then Ramin said, well, wait, some of them are a little duplicative, I think. So we stopped then. So as you all know, and I wish Ramin were here, I actually reached out to him and I said, well, do you want to talk about yours? And at that point, he sent me a document that he had marked up and color coded. I'm thinking that I can at least share, show, right, all different things color coded, where he had taken different themes and kind of marked through the document with wording or ideas that he thought were in one place or the other. And so what the result was he and I looked at that and I said, okay, you do have a point. I agree with you there. So if we were to look at these, there's some new ideas in a couple of these. How do we look at moving these couple that are new, maybe making them part of number one? And then we had some new ideas. So Lisa, thank you for putting that in the screen so that all of us can see it that way.
Absolutely. So a little note before we move to the redlining. Honoring is highlighted in something that we've already agreed upon. And so we will actively engage with those who feel the impact of racism most directly, seeking their input, guidance, and honoring the wisdom of their experience. And I see, Marianne, that you suggested highlight. And so I think highlight and honoring are different in this context.
No. I'm not suggesting the word highlight. I think that's just saying I formatted it by highlighting.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm not suggesting that word at all.
Okay.
There was honoring showed up in another place, and I believe that we now, so it says there's a place lower where we used honor and respect. So just I note that it's a word that shows up in two places, once in the vision with the bullets under the vision and once in the guiding principles. And there may be an alternate word choice that's appropriate in one or the other place. So that's the only flag of that.
Okay. So I would offer up that honoring in this initial statement is important. So even if we remove it someplace else, I think in the vision statement, it's important to have it up front and center. So I welcome other thoughts on that point.
I thought the addition was appropriate, and I feel like it fills in here. And I think when we get to the guiding principles, we can talk about any conflict at that point.
Okay.
Okay. All right, then why don't we leave this here, because that was what we had before. And yeah, we can just exit out. I think that will take it away. So say continue. Well, let's see what it does.
There
Yeah.
we, okay,
Perfect.
good, excellent. Okay, and so now we get into the redlining, although I hate the term redlining. So the intensified pink suggestions. for the guiding principles. And some of them I found to be wordsmithing, and then others I thought we should talk about the suggested deletions, additions, etc. And so why don't we just start with number 1, point A, people of color will see others of color in leadership roles in government, business, the school system, and civic groups. And so it's really a wordsmithing, and also I think more sophisticated language with regard to those who look like you to others of color. Are there any objections to that change?
I don't see an objection, but I do want to highlight the fact that we are in working on number 1, we're completely eliminating the redundancy that we had for number 2. So I just want to make sure that we're aware of talking about that. Is that correct?
I'm totally aware of that. And I think if you have scrolled down to number 2, you'll see that there's a huge suggestion about that as well.
And really the reason that that's suggested is had to do with what ideas were in different places, and then taking the things that were still unique in number 2, and they've actually moved up into another point in number 1.
And I really think it's a variation in approach. So do we want to talk about the categories that are likely to be the focus of your focus areas and your goals and objectives later, and separate those out into more general terms of community, or collapsing them into one? And that, I think we have to try it on and see what we feel better about. So if no one takes issue with replacing those who look like you with others of color, then I will accept that suggestion. And Marianne, I'll defer to you to look for hands, because I only have the single column since I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah. And I'm trying to get the hands to pop out here. And of course, they're not wanting to behave and do that.
And so we would invite folks to unmute and speak up in the absence of the visibility of the raised hand, or you physically raising your hand.
I think I might have everybody now.
Okay, great. So
Okay.
I'm going to accept that.
Yep.
And this is grammatical.
Yeah.
This is grammatical.
So I made all of them say will whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's point A, point B, point C, point D is an addition drawn from the point below. I mean, the number 2 below. Residents will feel safe and validated, and there is accountability in all town-related activities. And I think that town was capitalized for intentionally.
And that used to talk about there was accountability in processes. And Ramin at the time said, well, what do you think you mean by processes? So that led to this discussion that it got to these words. But I think that's the conversation for this group. Jen.
Hi, everybody. So I'm looking at C and D in particular, and I'm not sure if I feel like E falls into the same category, but I feel like if these are the guiding principles of what town government committees, working groups are going to be using to guide their work, I don't know that we can say that, that the students are going to experience discipline administered fairly, or that residents will feel safe and validated. I feel like maybe we need to change the actor in those statements so that it's like we're being guided, or we are setting forth a guidance that would create a situation where students in schools would experience fair discipline, or where we're creating opportunities or processes that will validate people's experiences and make them feel safe. There's something about that sounds strange to me.
So something like the level of accountability in town-related activities will result in residents feeling safe and validated. Is that what you mean, Jim, when you say change the actor?
I guess something like that, or like that's what the town is setting up their processes to do. I don't know. It just seems like we want to be guided by a principle where we are trying to make people feel safe and validated, but I don't know that it's a principle in itself. Because we have no control over whether somebody feels safe or validated. We only have control over the processes that we're creating to try to.
Right. So I think the lettered points are examples of the guiding principle number 1. And that is stating what racial equity means in terms of the experience of people of color being the same as the white majority.
Natasha, do you want to add something here?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to figure out, that's very specific, the discipline piece. I'm just trying to figure out if it's discipline, if it will not, the students will not be segregated and they would be treated fairly in sports. Like, I mean, there are a lot of different pieces to how they are treated fairly in school. So we're only talking about one of them. Should this relate to a different document that is already putting principles together for the schools, or is this the one that puts it together for the schools? I'm just trying to figure out, because it's not just discipline. There are a lot of other pieces. That's a very important part, but there are a lot of other pieces that are related to the schools and this is not the only one.
So
No,
this
that's a great point, Natasha. And, remember that many of these statements and phrases came from members of the committee, I would say most. And so this is what resonated with a particular committee member. And I think that, through this process, it would certainly be allowable for us to expand upon that as we have in previous phrases. So it could even be generalized to talk about, so what comes to mind for me, and this is my personal experience, so I'll put that caveat out there, is tracking, right? So the kids of color were tracked into disciplinary segments of their grade, having nothing to do with their intelligence or ability, right? So that already goes beyond discipline. And it's hard for me to read into what one of you submitted as this response. So I do agree that broadening it could be more helpful, but I wonder if this is the problem area, so to speak, and that's why this was what was highlighted from one of you.
So the other thing I think it's important to keep in mind is, and I'm wondering almost if somehow we might need to say, for example, here, because these are not our goals and objectives for these areas, but it was intended to hit on some key elements that we're going through, now, sort of housing, policing, schools, the hiring practices. These are the large buckets in the town government. So just thinking about giving an example in this. Jay, and then Toyin.
So that was going to move to my point. If we're going to be focused on, or if we want to say something in regards to those 3 areas of policing, housing, and schooling, what are the racial equity items that we want to work on? Because when I look at, and I don't want to jump around, but if I look at E, for me, traffic stops and citations, it isn't as broad as what we would want to address when it comes to overall policing and equity. So maybe to the point at which Jim was trying to make, which I would agree with, is, what areas do we want to focus as it pertains to, bias or equity as it relates to those three categories?
Toyin, do you want to add to that?
I just thought maybe in the first sentence, we can just have it end with, for example, colon, and then go through a bunch of, and so that way it's not very specific. And then I feel like for students, it should just be something about their educational experience should be similar in, as far as discipline, as far as leveling and all that kind of stuff. So I just think it should be like, education should be similar, Then for the police, I think it should be that people of color are, you know, or not cite, you don't want to be very specific, they have very specific language, but like the justice system treats people of color at the same rate or proportion that they are in the town or something like that. So it's not very specific, because I think we'll get in trouble if we do very specific for these things. But I just feel like just keep them just categories. So 1 is you know, government, 2 is education, 3 is policing, 3 is social interaction in the town, and you just kind of have general statements about all those. But you start it all with, for example, so it's not, doesn't limit us to that.
Yeah, okay. Sue, did you want to build too?
So I do agree with the concept of, you know, the example or, you know, individual specific ideas. So on the one hand, a generic statement about what students experience can be more encompassing, but it may not really be specific enough for people to wrap their, you know, arms around, well, what does this even mean? So I think with the schools in particular, not only are we talking about discipline and the tracking issue, which is big in terms of seeing students of color at all levels of like the high school way of, you know, dividing classes, you know, what in that domain. But also, you know, are we reading about characters and authors of different backgrounds and experiences? So there's so many, you know, so the curriculum is also a component of this. And I just think that, you know, there are a lot of things that we can either specify or give examples or be generic about, but, and I'm okay either way. I just think we have to clarify how we're approaching it.
Marianne?
Yeah, Matt?
Thank you. And I agree, I think with Toyin's, I think it was Toyin who said about being general here, because I think if you get too specific, as was mentioned, then it really just focuses on that one area. And I think as we grow as a committee and learn more as a committee, we can always add or bullet under those. For example, if you're talking about schools and just saying that students in school experience equity, you know, make it general, and then we drill down more as we go through this and say, you know what, there is an issue with A, B, and C, then you can say, I think, cite examples at that time. I agree with leaving it general, even when it comes to traffic stops and citations. I don't know if that's the best, again, metric for that. So I think it should be, you know, not be disproportionately represented some in a general, more general way. So I agree with Toyin to that extent.
So let me ask a question. Lisa's suggested there on the path to racial equity, these things would be true, which is another way of, for exampling, maybe. So we could consider that. If we look at item A, are we satisfied with item A? I'm seeing nods.
Yes.
Okay. Next question would be item B, which is sort of adjacent to Sue's comment about curriculum as an element a little bit, but we made a specific call out in item B for students young and old, which really gets to everybody in town, I think. How do we feel about B? That I'm looking at looks like we're probably okay with.
That one, if it's students, I kind of feel like it should be not opportunities, will learn a more complete version of American history. If it's the general populace, then we'll have opportunities. But I feel like with the students, I would like, if we're going to talk about curriculum, I would like to push that their curriculum is changed, like is more thorough. So I don't know whether we want to keep students young and old and make it just put that in the students portion, or maybe the community will be given opportunities to learn about complete version American history, and then put something in the students thing about more diverse curriculum or something.
potentially.
So I was
Got it.
interpreting students young and old as lifelong learners. So not even traditional students as in K through 12.
Mhm.
So maybe it would be better to have that come after students in schools will experience.
But
I
aren't we
think it's
referencing-
confusing. The students young and old to me is confusing.
Okay.
I would just.
I
say
would change
community,
it to the community,
Our
like
community.
our community. And then, yeah,
And then C does say curriculum for students, so that works.
Do you mind if I just jump in for a second, Marianne?
Sure, go ahead.
So the one thing that stands out to me about B that's different, the other ones are more reflective about experience or how people feel. And that one is more of a, what are we going to provide? So I'm not sure that it's parallel to the other ones. And it might be a level down. I'm raising that question.
I hear you. I'm thinking about that.
I didn't mean to stop the conversation. So if everybody
No.
really likes this point, I'm fine with it.
I guess when I think about if we're giving this to other boards in the town, I actually want them to think about how they can help create some of these opportunities. So I sort of like calling it out here. But that's kind of one of the angles that I'm thinking about it from. How are they going to contribute to this?
I'm fine with it the way it is. I don't think the document has to all be about feelings in general. I think it's fine.
Vivian?
I guess I'm going back to something that I was reflecting on the other day, and on the conversation we had last time, which is that one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that the community is educated about history, right? And that there's an openness to listening and learning and incorporating that into the work that any board, committee, or department will be engaged in. So while I think that we want to have something that's generalized, I wonder if this is where we want to hone in on a little bit of that idea that the community will have those opportunities to be educated about the historical perspectives of everybody in town. That it's not just limited to the school system.
So does saying our community feel like it's limited to the school system?
I guess I'm just trying to clarify, what did we mean, and this is going back, but what did we mean when it was the phrase students young and old was suggested? What was who's in that population, I should say?
So I think I thought about it the way that Lisa did. Matt?
I thought everyone in our community, I think it was just a broad umbrella.
Yeah.
When we change that, then we go to C, and then maybe a little more specific there, or maybe we say equity in all aspects of their education, and then we hit on the education more in that paragraph. I think Torian again was saying, I think we have to acknowledge the curriculum in that C, but maybe a broader just equity in all aspects somewhere, something like that. So it's broad. So I know curriculum, I think when you look at discipline, placement, acknowledgement, to me, that's all aspects of education that would encompass that. But I think curriculum is separate, where you really want to hone in and say, and have a curriculum that focuses on these issues.
Well, do we say, could we say community members will have opportunities as opposed to students young and old?
So I think we pulled out students young and old and replaced it with our community.
Okay,
Do you see that, Vivian?
yeah, I'm looking at two screens here, which is
Okay, all right. So I think we pulled out students young and old, replaced it with our community will have opportunities to learn a more complete version of American history and its relevance to today's challenges. And then we have one specific to students in schools.
I think that works.
And do we like the wording on C? Is that green too bright? Should I make it blue or something?
That green is tricky.
It's
Is there a
difficult to
darker
read.
green maybe or something? I don't know if they have a different green.
Doesn't have to
blue.
be green at all. Let's go with blue.
That's better.
I was just trying to match my shirt. Just kidding. I'm not trying to-
I just think the word acknowledgement seems redundant with recognition, and somebody else mentioned extracurriculars, and I think that maybe that should be included instead of acknowledgement.
So since I just typed that up quickly, for me, acknowledgement is different from recognition. I was thinking, and I don't know which belongs to what, in classroom acknowledgement or recognition, and then sort of more broadly acknowledgement and recognition of contributions.
I see.
But if
That
it's
makes sense.
unclear,
No,
then
that,
maybe
that
we
makes
don't need
sense.
to-
That's good. But maybe we do need to add extracurriculars.
I agree, Sue. Yeah, I think because it's not just during the day within the curriculum and with the discipline, but it's also after school and anything that's related to.
Yeah, co-curricular is a good term.
So is it co-curricular or extracurricular?
Do
So
we have oh, here's Sue.
my
No.
background lends me or encourages me to say co, because I feel like co-curricular activities are just as important in some instances for some students than curricular. Extra means that you could do with or without it. But if you're a high school student applying to colleges, you know that those activities are far from extra. You actually need to point out how special you are beyond your GPA and test scores.
Well, and in higher ed, the term is used to reflect the entire educational experience, not just the classroom experience. Yeah.
Right. So I
I
like
think the question is,
co-curricular.
what will resonate with the Needham audience? Is it extracurricular or co-curricular? Because I don't need to put my higher ed bias on this at all.
So I'm comfortable with co-curricular, but I do think that's something we can check when Sue's back to see if there's, I can't remember specifically what the phrasing is at the high school, and she would be most familiar. So we can double check that. I would ask a question here about whether discipline is the category that we want to lead with in this group of examples.
I agree, maybe.
I'll lead with pace with placement.
Yes.
That feels much more important to me. And they all have to be right, but as an academic place, it feels like academically to focus there.
And I know that we may not want a very long list, but I wonder if we want to also include the word engagement or involvement. Yeah, well, you've got involvement in there, but
Involvement.
maybe classroom engagement, or I don't know exactly how Sue would look at that, but it seems to me that that's something we want to encourage the schools to do as a fundamental principle of providing a rounded educational experience is to engage students.
I like the idea of leaving it independent, because I know that many high school students basically survive high school as opposed to thriving. And I think establishing relationships with peers and faculty and staff are what denotes engagement as opposed to just getting through it. So I do think it stands alone.
Do we feel that the list is limiting? And I know it's not intended to, but I'm thinking with the legal hat on, when you say sometimes including but not limited to, and then you give a list, but I don't say we have to get all legalese with it. I just want to make sure people don't think it's somehow limiting to not have verbiage saying not limited to.
Well, maybe change the IE to EG. Would that work, Matt?
Sure, that's fine with me. Whatever the committee, what the group thinks, but I just want to make sure people don't feel it's limiting, because I'm used to that, including but not limited to.
We paid a lot in law school fees to tuition to earn the privilege of using that phrase.
Very good, very good.
Oh my
Exactly.
gosh, I was like IEEG included but not limited to. What are the, so IE is included but not limited to? Is that what that means?
IE means that is, as opposed to EG, which I think
It's
is,
for example.
for example, or by way of suggestion.
Got it. So if you want to say included but not limited to, you have to spell that out. There's no.
Yeah, and then it looks like a contract or something.
I'm going to go back to the basics of Strunk and White and just stick with EG.
Okay, got it.
So what do we think about C as a whole at the moment? Does that get us where we were going?
I think it's encompassing as you look at education. I think we have to be mindful of how we replicate that for policing and housing. If we're going to do the same, to be parallel.
Yep, I think that's a good comment.
Mhm.
So
I
we're
agree.
working our way down to those.
Okay. So D has been pulled up from 2. So let's just see how it sits without referencing 2 if we can. Residents will feel safe and validated, and there is accountability in all town related activities.
Is there a way that we can, similar to how we did C, which is why I just made that comment, to incorporate E into that? Because you can start with safe, being valid, and then talk about policing items, if you will, the same way that we went through the placement, acknowledgement, and recognition.
So it would read then, for example.
Or you would
People-
start with residents will feel safe. There was another word I was thinking and escaped my mind very quickly. Safe, I was going to say safe, equal, and validated. We'll come back to equal in a second. And there's accountability in all town related activities. And then you can go, e.g. if you want to use the same, policing, because it's more than just traffic stops and citations. So I want to be careful on that. There's arrests, there's, a ton of other things.
So people of color will experience equity in the enforcement of policing.
Well, residents will feel safe and validated and treated equitably.
Yeah.
For example,
And
Police.
do we want to use policing, or do we want to use public safety?
with respect to public safety. I think it goes beyond police and public safety too. Is that the point you were trying to make, Jay?
Yes, it
Yes.
can be broader, but I think at some point we do have to acknowledge the policing.
Correct, correct.
So residents will feel safe, validated.
I just don't
Jacob said
understand
safe,
D. What is
equal,
D
and
trying to say?
validated.
And treated. Was
And-
that you, Vivian? I missed what you said.
And
No.
treated equitably.
So what is D trying to say though? Like, I don't understand D at all. Like residents, are we talking about people of color or are we talking about residents? So when we first started that statement, I thought it was more that if there's like sort of a discussion and conflict, that someone would feel safe to discuss their views despite who they are.
Okay, so that's a
So
good,
I didn't even understand the statement. So now that you're putting is it people of color we're talking about? Will feel safe and validated?
so, no, that's a great point. Because it was pulled out of number 2, I think it's important to go back to number 2 with the lead was Needham will be a town where the color of your skin does not dictate your experience. And there is a unified front against racial injustice. And so C in that category is residents will feel safe and validated and there's accountability in all processes.
Yeah, for me, it doesn't fit where it is now, the way it's phrased, because I was thinking it was all residents. So, I mean, personally, I think E should be moved to D and then we discuss the policing issues, because I think that should be a separate issue about safety with the justice system, and then we can discuss safety or feeling comfortable in other situations. But I kind of feel like D is inadequate for what we're trying to say. If we're going to do about policing, let's just make one thing about policing. So enough stuff in policing we can talk about. But,
So I hear you, and I wonder if we want to pause for a moment to see if we agree that 2 should be eliminated. Because what has happened is some of 2 has been folded into 1.
I mean, I think we can get everything from 2 into 1. I think.
Okay. So you said make E D, is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I think it's more important, at least when I first thought of it as just all residents feel safe discussing stuff, I thought E should come first. But if D is going to be about policing and safety, then we should be very clear. People of color will, feel safe and go on X, Y, Z,
Okay, well, we're flipping these around. Marcus, do you want to add to this? Oops, you're muted, or we can't hear you. You don't look muted, but we can't hear.
Do you have Bluetooth headphones or something attached somewhere? Because we can't hear you.
Oh, no.
I was going to say, sometimes I've seen people have to leave and come back in. I mean, all different kinds of things. We'll see if we can figure it out. All right. What would be our EGs for policing? In the beginning, we had this with number of traffic stops and citations. And
Can you hear me
Lisa,
now?
I remember, can we hear you? Yes.
Yes. All right. That's good. Sorry about that. Just the word residence in E, I feel like since we've talked about people that come in that work, that come in and out of town, so something more like all people or everyone or something like that, since it can't be just residents, because there's going to be so many other people that are in and out, I think.
Yeah.
So related to people of color and its consistency in this bullet is also what we've done in A, B, and C, which is will, and then we get to D and we say will not. So I wonder if we wouldn't want to change D to a will statement as opposed to a will not. And there may be compelling reasons not to, but.
Well, I think why don't we try making it a will statement and see if it can work?
But that's what you have for E already, right? I know we're on D, but that's where you have for E already, right? I think changing it from previously from where we had residents to people of color, it's within the same line of where you're trying to go, right?
So I think people of color is okay, but do we want to say in D, instead of people of color will not be disproportionately represented, do we want to say people of color will be
I almost feel like D and E should be combined.
Yes.
You know, so
Right.
people of color
Yes,
will feel safe and treated equitably. And then in terms of policing, then you could put parentheses, e.g., the things we want to put. And there's, you know, and then their accountability in all town related activities. I feel like those two are trying to say the same thing now that we've changed E to people of color will feel safe. I think that's where we now should put the rest of the policing issues.
So I think Jay mentioned that at some point.
So if we wanted to continue on, I would say arrest, motor vehicle stops, and use of force, just taking those straight from the statistics that were put out so that we can measure them and have metrics attached to them. Obviously, there's a lot more that we can add in, but those are consistent to the data that we already have.
I even feel like maybe some of the portions that were more or worse, like criminal, you know, I can't remember the term of it, but like that was pretty disproportionate. Arrests was pretty disproportionate. So some of, you know, I think there's some more things that affect people's lives a lot more than a motor vehicle stop should go before.
Marianne,
Yeah,
as far as we still haven't had the policing, I just don't want to put the cart before the horse because we have a whole section on policing. So I think it would make sense if we had this broad, you know, like equitably respect to public safety, maybe a couple things in there, and then maybe add to it as we, again, drill down and speak with the chief and say, oh, this is kind of what's disproportionate after we get more explanation and information than just the raw data. But I just want to be careful of being too specific.
well, so again, this is a for example, so
Yeah.
I don't know that it's limiting in that sense.
And we can always modify it later based on what we find. So I think.
We can.
Okay.
I also don't want to minimize perception and experience.
Right. Yep.
There is one other category in the data, it's criminal application. I'm not sure the full definition of that, but when you look at the numbers and as a percentage, when it applies to Black versus non-Black, it is quite high.
Striking even.
Right.
And the use of handcuffs, I think, was up there as well.
So I think D makes a strong statement. I think we want to have the data to back it up, but again, pursuant to my previous comment about perception, because a lot of what happens is not documented, and I'm not saying that's the case for Needham.
Right.
Right.
Um,
Lisa, can I ask a question? Is there a reason why you use fair motor, why you characterize motor vehicle stops as fair as opposed to the other ones?
I wrote what I heard, that's all.
I would just say motor vehicle stops, just.
Okay.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like that list will be refined as we go
Yeah.
through the data and have explanations from the police, but
And maybe that, maybe that is, oh, what's the word? Oh, gosh. Maybe it was unconscious, because I do feel for myself that I've been stopped unfairly once the police officer saw me, as opposed to if they hadn't seen me, right? So I don't know that that's why I've typed it. I think I was just typing fast based on what I heard.
So, and this phrase is for public safety. So for me, public safety is police and fire. I'm just going to ask, is there something that's fire related or EMT related, which is another function of our public safeties that should be an attribute in here?
I was actually kind of feeling like F could address that, sort of the perception and how people of color are treated in the town. I was thinking maybe we could work that in that section,
Okay,
because I do think it's important to sort of the perception of people of color in the town. It's
Yeah.
important.
Could we say something to the effect of, response method and rate of response or something like that? To bring in, all public safety? And the other question I had was in terms of, I know the term criminal applications is by statute, and it's what's reflected in the report. I don't know how many people are going to understand what it means. So I don't know if we want to say civil and criminal designations or something like that. Just wanting to broaden it.
because it's a term I don't know. Is this warrants and citations? Is it beyond that?
I'm not sure
Does
that was
anybody-
my question. I just saw it as I just see it on the police report that we saw for the Department of Enforcement data.
It's a designation as to whether or not the charge is criminal or not. Whether it's
Jay, is that from the EJN report?
It's from the 2020 Needham Police Department Enforcement data.
Oh,
Right.
gotcha.
It-
Is
Right.
that when, my understanding of that term is when the police have information that a crime has occurred, but they were not there at the time of the crime, so they didn't make an arrest. But that way, if they decide that they want to later make an arrest of somebody or charge somebody with a crime, they fill out a criminal complaint that summonses the individual to court to be arraigned on criminal charges.
It's a criminal citation. Just looking at it's under the Massachusetts Uniform Citation. If the box is checked for criminal application, it means that the individual is being accused of a criminal offense as opposed to a civil offense. And I think that's the marked difference in many, many communities where there's an uneven application or decision-making process as to how to designate the particular situation, the infraction. And I'm
So-
not a criminal attorney or expert, but that's what I'm seeing when I look at the term under the statutes.
So it feels to me, if the term criminal application is a term of art,
Yes.
right? It feels to me like we should stick with the term of art instead of trying to give other terms, and we may need to think down the road. This could be an item that belongs in a glossary and gets defined there, but perhaps we use the term of art here.
I agree with that.
I don't know if the term itself has such, I don't know, maybe like the lack of understanding makes it kind of a useless word to have in there. Because if this is aimed at people who don't understand what that term means, I don't know that they're going to walk away from it understanding what we're trying to say. And I think that what we're trying to say is that more people of color are given citations for, or are being criminally charged for things that maybe a white person that's being stopped might be just getting a civil summons to. Is that what the distinction is there?
I don't think we know. I think it's important to use the art as Marianne said. And when we speak to the chief and we look closely at this data, because it is a problem area for both Black and Hispanics, that we clearly understand what's in it. And I think it's a good conversation point for people to be able to get to know what that term means, because it seems to be widely used.
Agree, completely agree.
Okay, so I think that we would say, do we still want to say civil and criminal application, or just criminal application?
I'd prefer to use criminal application, but I'd open it up to the other group to decide.
I'd use that term too. I think that's what's.
And it matches to the
Data.
chart that
Right.
will be public, so, okay. So criminal applications,
So not designations.
not designations, I
Oh,
think.
okay.
And then I do think we'll have to come back and track this one for something that belongs in a glossary, so.
I'm looking quick at the EGN report. I know handcuffs is something that's gone up quite a bit over.
Did
To
we-
add that possibly as well within like use of force and in that section. Or would that be under use of force? Or like using handcuffs disproportionately?
I think it would be under use of force, but I don't know enough about the technicalities.
Not that they didn't count handcuffs as use of force.
Then it should be separately then.
So I believe handcuffs are counted separately, is my
Okay.
understanding, so you could say
That should be in there.
handcuffing is a separate item.
Okay. That should be in there. Just like I got to glance at it, but they did a lot of research. It's pretty in depth. So
I do though want to make sure we use primary sources on some of this data, make sure that that's.
what do you mean by that?
In other words, if you take the exact source of the data, like the police, instead of taking data and then having an opinion on that data and then using that kind of secondary source information. So, and I bet EJ, and I haven't seen the report, but I'm assuming that information they use is primary source from the police department.
Yeah, everything they had to pay for, a lot of that information. And then I know they had to review by quite a few different people.
Got it.
Okay, so Lisa, if we can go into D, and
Sure.
after use of force,
Mhm.
or somewhere in there, add handcuffing as a attribute.
So it reads, people of color will feel safe, validated, and treated equitably with respect to public safety. For example, arrests, use of force, motor vehicle stops, traffic infractions, handcuffing, and criminal applications.
Okay,
And then E is kind of piecemealed as it was a drop off from something else. An equity lens and accountability is applied to all town-related activity. So an equity lens is, I would say, is applied, and accountability, something, there needs to be a word there, because it's sort of two different.
Just a comment if I could on that. Because in D, it said people of color will feel safe, validated, and when I first read that, that was just the town-related activities, which my understanding was that people of color will feel safe if they, go into town hall, or they'll feel welcome going in all town-related aspects of life. And this is kind of saying something different. So I would like, this is fine about an equity lens, but I would like to also add the fact that people of color will feel safe and validated in their relationship with the town, which I think was the original comment. So I don't know how to wrap that in, because I know D is now just police, but I think it's kind of an important point that as a town, capital T as a whole, that people feel safe and validated and treated equitably in their dealings with the town.
I don't think that there's a problem with repeating that, actually, Matt.
How about if where you have people of color will feel safe because their experiences will be honored and respected as valid or validated, will feel safe, validated, and included because could you say in all town related activities because their voices and experiences will be honored and respected?
So combining E and F?
Yes.
So I kind of liked F because I see it. I worry when we say town with a capital T, town related activities, that it relates to town government, right? And I saw F as being broadly applying anywhere in the community.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, if a citizen or resident requests something of the town, or tries to get a permit, or tries to get a document, or goes into town hall, that they feel exactly the same or valid or treated the exact same as how I originally read it, which I think is an important statement.
Can I add on to that?
Yep.
Can you guys hear me? So along with that, and we think of, town government, you think of town meeting and the role that it plays, approving budgets and putting forth articles and things like that. And town meeting is one of those rooms where it's, very much so of the majority, and there's not a lot of representation at all in there. So when we're thinking about being in that room where nobody kind of looks like the minority, having something along the lines of, if you are presenting an article or something, recommending something, how does it impact racial equity? Like, how does that, what you're presenting, how in a positive manner or something, what would that look like? Because I feel like being in those rooms or not being in those rooms, and kind of having that lens on it with people that aren't of the majority, that are definitely not in those rooms. If we're thinking all town related government and things, I feel like the town meeting is very important. And it's not like it's going to become really diverse overnight, but what do you think about that in that lens to push that?
So does E cover that? That's my question. Or do you need to build on E to cover that?
Maybe build on E and give an example. I feel like something like town meeting, I just know that I know how many people that are a part of that, the hundreds or however many we have in that is not going to be the experience. There's not going to be people in those rooms of the minority for the most part. It's going to be overwhelmingly the majority. So how are we speaking for those people without the voice in that room? And I feel like if we're doing something where we're making racial equity a point, or something that people are presenting are going to be affected in a positive manner for those people that aren't there, I think that could be something that could be powerful, or something that we should definitely consider.
So we're saying that we want this statement to be true, whether somebody is paying a bill, signing up for swimming lessons, getting a permit, or attending town meeting as a town meeting member, or participating in town meeting as a town meeting member.
Or participating in any town activities, whether it's,
Right.
you know, going to open swim at Rosemary or, you know, going to the 4th of July celebrations. I mean, I think it's, you know, yeah, utilization of town services, participation in town activities or in town events, great.
Government, town events and
Well,
town.
so we have town meeting there, but
Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't know if it is making sense, but I get what you're saying, kind of adding this, but I mean, in terms of, you know, when people, all the different committees and stuff, and people come to town meeting to present an article or something like that, when you present it, how is that article gonna positively impact, you know, racial equity for whatever you're saying, or how are we gonna be accountable for, you know, how we're pushing forward in that sense? Does that make more sense, Marianne, or what I'm saying in line with that? So not just that we feel validated and things like that, but, you know, if we're taking a step further, since we know the minority is something that, not saying the minority is, you know, overlooked, or I just wanted, I guess I just want to, the voices in the room of the majority that are doing stuff, depending on whatever committee it is, when they're presenting new articles or new things, you know, how are we taking that racial lens or that racial equity lens and incorporate it into what they're presenting, and how is it gonna, you know, affect whether, you know, if it's with hiring or money, or that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. And I don't know if that makes sense. Or I think Jen or Ramin or probably
so,
want to say more. I
so
don't
I
know.
think I think we have Jen and Ramin, and I think Toyin actually was waving his hand up first.
Well, I just felt
think
like
some
what,
of those, I just want to say, I think some of those markets are going to come in goals specifically with that lens, to be very specific about that. But I think, Toyin.
yeah, so I feel like this whole document so far until E has been from the perspective of people of color. And I think Marcus is going from the perspective of the majority. So I felt like if we're gonna switch over, and it looks like F switches over there, so the voice and experience of people of color will be honored and respected as valid, and sort of decisions made by people, the decisions made by town members will keep in mind the experience, or keep in mind the effect that their decisions have on people of color. Is that what you're trying to say, Marcus? That more,
Yeah, kind of more so. That's what I'm trying to say. But even more specifically, like, yeah, keeping those people of color in mind, especially those people that don't have a seat at the table. And when you're making decisions or things like that, how is it going to negatively or positively affect, you know, the people that are of the minority and not in the room? So that's kind of what I'm trying to sum up, Toyin.
so I feel that's more like an F, that we're moving away from. I don't think it's an E. I think it's more an F, that statement would be that when decisions are made, that people of color are considered, and consider, you know, the effects they're going to make, or the effects they'll have on us will be considered. I mean,
So decision-making at what level?
I think then you can do an EG list. Then you can do like a, you know, town meetings, hiring practices, you know, whoever makes decisions. Employers, politicians, real
Funding
estate,
allocations.
housing.
Can you say in the decision-making process, people of color will be honored and respected in all in decision?
And then taking a step further, like if they're being considered, in what way are we holding that accountable? Like what does considered mean? So if I'm of the majority and I'm trying to make a decision for people of the minority, and I'm saying, oh, I think we should do that, that may help. But what are we really doing in terms of really measurable, or how is it being held accountable? Like what is actually the process? And I know something we talked about, you know, a year from now, holding people to see, you know, what they've done or what they haven't done. But I just know that could be don't think I have the right words to say what I'm trying to say, but I know Jen has her hand up, but I don't know what she wants to say.
Jen, do you want to add to this?
So I guess what I'm thinking about is a bullet that is, I think, focused on the town actors. And I think this relates to what you were saying, Marcus, that we are asking if racial equity is existing in Needham, that anybody who's in the position of power to make a decision is pausing before implementing any new decisions to ask themselves, are there any of my personal biases or prejudices that are impacting the policy or the decision that I'm making? And then also, is the policy or decision that I or my board is making, does it have a disparate impact on people of color in town? So like putting an affirmative duty onto the decision makers to consider a different perspective, consider whatever biases they might be bringing to the discussion, and also to looking into, even if the policy, for example, that we're putting forward is race neutral, is it having an impact on certain folks in the community more than others?
Yes, and yes, Jen. And then I think anytime anybody is implementing or trying to provide like a new article, having kind of like a racial impact statement, a racial equity impact statement along with the article they're presenting, or something that's like, yes, we want to do this and this how it may affect. Does that make more sense? Like kind of have something along the line so we know that we're, okay, this is what you've considered, this is what you want to add and be a part of what you're trying to do to push this town forward, or push the article that you presented at town meeting through. I have this racial equity, kind of statement to be like, this is this, and that. Or is that, I don't know if that's asking for too much. I don't think it is, because we know how disproportionately things are now. I think that's just holding that additional accountability piece within that.
For
So I'm
every,
not-
sorry, I'm sorry, Mary.
Go ahead.
No, I was just trying to get some clarification. So if you have an article, let's say, to fund a field, or you have an article to restore a building, or is it just certain articles that are social in nature? I'm just trying to understand. I just don't want to get bogged down in town meeting and issues around articles.
Okay.
Practical. I'm just thinking practical right now.
Yeah. Jen, do you have a quick thought? Otherwise, I'm looking at the clock and I need to do a time check here.
I think it's a quick one. That whenever decisions are being made, that the question be intentionally raised, is there a racial equity impact that we should be considering on this particular decision or policy or procedure that we're putting into place?
So I
So just-
think,
Sorry.
I think that's actually a good point for us to capture. I don't think we're finishing these tonight. Hope springs eternal every time that we're going to finish these, but there's two things. We had intended to wrap this up earlier, and I know Lisa actually had a hard stop, and we have guests who are waiting to come talk to us about housing, which is another critical issue. So it feels to me like I want to capture Marcus's thought here, or maybe Marcus's thought with Jen's, just to at least put a placeholder that says, is there a question that's asked as a part of town decision-making? And I think the analog that I think is when we do hiring pools, we make sure that our hiring pools include people of color, but it's the analog of that for any decision-making. How are you thinking, doing a check in your decision-making to be sure that you've thought about impact on people of color of decision?
And Marianne, can I add that those 2 points be measured against the draft of F here that I've typed in, which is in the decision-making process, the voices and experiences of people of color will be honored and respected as valid. For example, equity in hiring, engagement, and promotion, programs and events are inclusive and equity-minded, intentional anti-bias efforts are employed in all considerations. So I think, so, you know, an email from each of you in response to that might be helpful in helping me sort of tweak the language around that for the next presentation and consideration.
Great.
And I would say that outside of that, we have the addition of number 5, all people commit to engaging with goodwill and respect in order to repair and build healthy relationships is another point of discussion, which I guess will be tabled. Oh, and I see another one. Okay, so I'll stop there. So in consideration of time, I think we're getting closer. We're getting closer. And I would extend the invitation from Mary Ann to add any resources that you might have in terms of glossary examples. We're probably most familiar with race equity tools, but there's tons of stuff out there for us to accept, reject, mull over, and tweak. So if you have something that you come across, please add that to the list for consideration.
So Lisa, we can resend out the link to this document to the team, right? So everybody can look it over and have some time to kind of think about what work we've done tonight
Yes.
and decide if we're in the right place or if we need to tweak. But I think this was a good discussion, again, trying to really expand it to say, what do we really mean here?
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear.
Mm-hmm. And I would also invite folks to go back and compare what now is a different set of 5 guiding principles than the original set of 5, given the attempted consolidation of 1 and 2, and then the addition of the 5th.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Ramin, and Mary Ann for meeting on this, getting us a foothold here.
Just a different lens. So Lisa, I want to say thank you again for another round here and helping us to move this ball forward productively.
Absolutely, my
See
pleasure.
you soon. See you soon.
Take care.
Right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. I haven't looked at who we have in the participants, but do we have Leah and Karen or in our attendees?
Yes.
All right. So I think if we could have them join us. Lee Newman, our Director of Planning, and Karen Sonnenberg. I don't know Karen's official title. Whenever we're talking about affordable housing, we always say, Karen, can you help us, please?
Community health specialist.
So I want to say that we sent out a summary document on housing and zoning for everybody that I'm hopeful that you found helpful in understanding sort of kind of where the town has come from, where we are currently, some of the history. Jay had sent us several questions, and I do think it's largely responsive to a number of those questions. We're trying to understand what's possible. I do want to say to the group, this document talks about affordability in the technical term, right? There is a technical term for affordability that's income-based in the state that looks at housing. There's another form of affordability where we talk about the fact that Needham is an expensive community, right? And so we have a variety of people who live in the community who would like to figure out how to downsize in the community or do other things in the community, who worry about the affordability, not in a technical term, but just affordable of housing in Needham. So those are almost 2 different ideas. One is this question of technical affordability, and the other is this question of how readily does somebody feel like they could enter the town from an affordable perspective. It seems to me from the conversation that we've had, none of the discussions about affordability matter if people of color who live in the town are not comfortable saying to their friends of color, Needham is a great town, you should move to Needham. So none of this matters if we don't solve that problem. And I think that's really the bigger issue that we'll need to grapple with in so many ways. But I want to start, so I just sort of wanted to start by laying that out. The town has spent a lot of time working to include or to improve and increase the number of affordable units, technically affordable units that we have in town. There is a threshold in the state to match the 10% affordability threshold. We continue, as we talk about new housing projects, to always include affordability in the discussion of any of the new housing projects so that we continue to build that stock in town. And I do think that the select board has on its agenda to come back and have a discussion about what does 40B look like in a town that's met that 10% threshold. How do we want to think about what our next level of goals are and how we size those? And I think that this group might in fact end up having some input into that conversation as well as we look forward. What does that look like? A number of people have asked about whether housing could be earmarked for people of color. That's a question that comes out a lot. That is actually considered a discriminatory practice. So that is not something that's able to be done. But, you know, certainly I think how you advertise, what kind of a net you cast to let people know that the opportunity exists, perhaps all of those are related to how that could be. But fundamentally, somebody's got to know that Needham is a good place for them to live. And we want that to be true for everybody. Okay. Hello, Lee and Karen. Jay's got a hand up, so if he's got a question to lead off with, I'm going to let him do that.
Thank you, Marianne. And thanks, Karen and Lee, for putting together this summary. It is quite comprehensive and it does hit on a lot of points. What I would like to ask you to focus on is access. You know, if you look through the information that you have, you know, there's almost 1,800 rental units. You know, half of that is earmarked, but for affordable housing. But how do people know what's available? And more importantly, how do they have the option to opt into those units? Do they turn over? You know, what's the age group that's available to it, and so forth?
I'll take that on.
Great, thank you, Karen.
That's a good question. When it comes to affordable units, the state is very prescriptive of what's required to affirmatively market those units. Over time, they become more and more, I think, clear and demanding on this affirmative marketing issue. So if there are any new units that are created, there has to be an affirmative fair housing marketing plan that's approved by the state and is implemented by the developer's designated marketing lottery agent. And then there is a whole marketing to the region through advertisements and then contacting entities outside of the town, flyers, you know, a whole kind of list of websites that have to be notified, etc. And then the application period is designated, and there's a lottery. I don't know how much information you want on this. As units turn over, there is still the need to affirmatively market those units so that people in the community and outside the community have an opportunity to apply for those units. And we are involved in actually dealing with the resales on a number of condos, 40B condos in town. And then there are other entities, monitoring agents for each project that are in charge of really making sure that as units turn over, that the affordability requirements are complied with.
Thank you. I have two follow-up questions for that.
Yep.
One, and this may be something that you have to follow up with us on, but do we know of those affordable units, how many are available? And then two, as an employer of the town, a lot of my employees have, live anywhere from 30 to an hour away because of affordability. I'd like to be able to understand as an employer, these folks are making roughly around 20,000, so that puts it underneath your 68,000, low income threshold here. But, they're young professionals and they don't have the ability to kind of sustain themselves, if you will, with that $20 to $22 an hour. What opportunities are available for them to have affordable housing within Needham? And some of these folks are people of color. I know we can't get into that from a discrimination perspective, but, given that income threshold, which is typically what's used, how do they seek out those resources in order to be an active part of the town as opposed to just a taxpayer for business purposes?
As units become available, we either are coordinating the outreach or working with monitoring agents to coordinate outreach based on state requirements. And we include those opportunities in the town's website under the Planning and Community Development Department's housing pages. There are no units available right now that we control. When I get a lot of inquiries about people wanting to live in Needham, and I keep a notification list of folks who want to be contacted should an affordable unit become available. And we also we have a summary of kind of major rental opportunities in town, the contact information. Basically, because there's a shortage of affordable housing, if somebody wants to, they're basically applying to get on a wait list, is what happens. And they have to contact the individual developments directly. And, I'll provide, guidance on that. With respect to, I gotta say, affordable housing is still relative, because even under 40Bs, the affordable rental is based on the area median income. So it's based on someone spending not more than 30% of income on, based on the 80% of area median income limit that's somewhat adjusted to number of bedrooms. So if someone's earning $20,000, they probably don't have the minimum income to afford even the affordable rental units. To get down to that income level, you're talking about within 30% of area median income. You're talking about a development that is financed with layers of subsidies from the state and probably some project-based Section 8 in order to make, to get down to that income level. And it's—
Karen,
Yeah.
did I miss it? Did you say, what is that number in Needham?
What is what
Like,
number?
what does that number net out to? The 80% of the median blow, that number equals to what kind of income?
A household of two is $77,000. A household of three, it's $86,650.
Okay.
An example is if it's a 2-bedroom unit, you would look at 2 persons, you look at a 3-person household based on the state requirements. So you would look at 86,650. You figure, and divide that by 12, you figure that no one can spend more than 30% of area median of their income on that unit. And then you come up with the rent minus any utility allowances. It's not, there is a formula that the state sets that they have to approve and that we work towards. It's also a formula for affordable home ownership.
Okay.
Mary,
Jay asked a question about whether there was a list, and you said you had a list. I'm curious, is that list a notify me list that's available on the town website? Could somebody choose a notify option to be notified in the event that there was affordable housing in the town available.
You know, that's a good idea, and I'm more than happy to add people to the list.
Okay, because it feels like having you be the sole owner of the list would be tricky. Somebody would have to know how to reach you. But so if it could be on the Notify Me tool, just as a place that people could sign up to be notified, that would make it more obvious.
Well, that would be great. You know, the more access, the better. At some point, the list has to come to me because I'm the one that's notifying them.
Right.
You know, there are other ways of improving access. That would be terrific.
Matt, did you have a?
Sure, just a couple things, just to put in perspective, because I've developed some affordable housing and in the western suburbs, not in Needham, and the affordable units, and you talk about Needham being a desirable place, even those affordable units, they're not diverse, the applicant pool, just from my experience. It's more local teachers and western suburbs. And so I think the first, as you said, is make Needham the place where you want people to come to and feel comfortable. But to give you an idea of when we talk about affordable, you're looking at about $2,000, $1,800, $1,900 a month for a 2-bedroom affordable.
Yeah, it's a little less.
Right. So I think in order to really get affordability, I think the town maybe, and I was thinking when you mentioned, Karen, Section 8 vouchers, kind of maybe give people a bit greater understanding of how they can apply for that, or employees can apply for that. Because I've had Section 8 tenants, which has really helped supplement their rent and be able to afford units that otherwise they couldn't afford. And then we'd have to look at going forward, reducing that, you know, enticing the developer to have, you know, 50% affordability instead of the 80% threshold, so that that number would come down and they'd be able to afford it. Because I think at 80% of median income, you know, you're throwing out large numbers. What'd you say for a 3-bedroom, it's $70-something thousand. It's a lot of money. So it's not really affordable. And I think that's the whole, it's not our fault, it's the state's fault too in this whole formula. So it's very difficult.
Yeah. One of the other questions that has been asked a lot that I also just want to put out as an idea is this question about restrictive zoning. All right. So in Needham, we have different categories, and I usually mix them up, but I'm going to say we have a category of housing called general residence, which does provide for multifamily housing in those cases. And that is zoned in several areas of town. And I think that it's an area that the planning board will be looking at relative to the new housing bill, which makes a recommendation that towns should look at space around a train station. Now, of course, they say that because most towns have a train station, they don't have 4 like we do. And but to the extent that this housing would be more accessible to public transit, that's the idea. And that it offer opportunities for multifamily housing. That's actually something that's already in place in many areas of Needham. So just another point. Jen, you were going to raise a hand, I think.
Yes, I had a question. And I'm sorry, I have not had a chance to get through your whole report here. So I apologize if the answer is in here. But of the inventory that we have in Needham of technically affordable housing, is there a percentage of that is designated for actual low income families, or I think what they call like extremely low income? So 30% of the AMI or 40% of the AMI, do we have any of those kind of units? Or when we kind of meet our minimum requirement for 40B, is that all with units that are really aimed at the higher level of AMI?
The housing authority units are lower, and they have a lot of their senior units are 30% and below. They really get to a population that really needs the public housing. But trying to think of some other,
But over,
other units that are on pitched to a lower level.
Do those housing authority units, do those count in the inventory that gets us to the 40B?
Absolutely.
yeah.
And
But
the-
I think within the 40B developments themselves, the 30% is really not hit. In Needham's case, they're mostly running at the 80% area median income.
Right. Right.
And is
Although
that,
there are opportunities, a lot of nonprofit organizations and communities, use the comprehensive permit in order to get permitting to do multifamily housing, and they go through, they use various state financing programs to get at different income tiers where, a significant portion, if not all of the units are actually affordable. And you get down to the 30% level. But but they're very challenging.
could Needham make a decision to look for more, to build more of those lower end units, lower income end units, or is that something that is not in the town's control? So if we're approving mostly projects that are aimed at people at 80% AMI, could we make a decision to ask for contractors to propose projects that are going to provide more units at 50% AMI even?
Well, I think the town can incent that. And I think in the neighborhood business district zoning, when we created the inclusionary provision, we included a provision which basically allowed for a 50% component with a density bonus established or associated with it. So I think if you're looking at inclusionary zoning and a certain percentage of units within rental developments that are proposed to be developed, you could create a structure where that becomes an incentive through a bonus or maybe a reduction in number of units that they have to have in that classification if they meet those lower thresholds. So there are ways, I think, to encourage that slant.
But it takes working with a developer to come to a package that they're willing to do economically. So it ends up being a negotiation and finding a developer who would be willing to work with you on that.
Right. Generally, I think it's framed as an option. It's framed, it can either be 80% or it can be 50%. And then maybe if you do a 50% option, the remainder of those units basically are marketed to a higher level, affordable level that goes above the 80, maybe it goes up to 100% of area median income.
The other thing is you need a property. We have a mission-driven regional nonprofit housing organization that's been looking for a property to develop a rental housing that gets to these lower income groups. And they're consistently outbid when it comes down to actually getting site control. That's an issue. And it also because the land prices are so high in Needham, in order to make a project work, you need some considerable density. And that's, also a constraint.
It's tricky.
That's related to a
Natasha?
question I have, if that's okay. Mary Ann.
Yep.
Thank you for Lee and Karen for coming in and talking to us about this. And I'm going through this document, and one of the questions that I have is, kind of the challenges, right? And one of them that you just talked about is the fact that purchasing, a house is very expensive here. So if you tear it down, you need to create a house at a high level, of cost to be able to do it. And that kind of discourages any type of diversity in housing costs in the town. Are there other towns that are doing, because you were talking about affordable housing, but then there's such a big discrepancy between the affordable housing and these tear downs and the other housing that we have in town. Are there ways of mitigating that? Have other towns been able to do that, where they were able to give incentives or something so that you can get starter homes for middle-class families as well?
Well, there are towns that are doing what's called cluster zoning or cottage style housing, but where you have smaller units clustered around some green space that, but you need property to do it with, and you need zoning to make it work. You can do it with 40B, but some communities have actually, done it through other kind of zoning mechanisms.
Well, and Karen, to be fair, have you seen those done truly at affordable levels, the 50 and 30% level, or?
No, you don't get down to that level. No.
Well, I was gonna say,
No,
I've seen those, but they've been much more
No, no, no.
expensive. No.
You're not going to see a single family home get down to 30, 50% of area median income, because you can't really expect that people are going to be able to pay much in order to make the project feasible. You need such a deep subsidy.
So for those, we're probably looking more at rental units that have density
Absolutely.
associated
Absolutely.
with them.
Absolutely.
Like the proposal that we've looked at from the Housing Authority that would rebuild units at the Housing Authority. But again, the Housing Authority is actually a state organization that is in Needham, and has a longer term plan that the town has, seen a first glance at, but talks about, is there a way to participate at some point in the future, depending on how that planning is going.
And then as a
Natasha,
I just have one, sorry, as a follow-up question to that, when we're looking at affordable housing, are we looking, it feels like the affordable housing, and maybe I have a different perception of it, and again, I have to educate myself on this, but it seems like it's contained in certain areas of town where that development is occurring. It doesn't feel like it's equitable in the sense of being dispersed throughout. It feels like it's contained. So I'm just wondering, is there something that can be done to encourage, these projects that are going on at all different levels to be more inclusive of this piece, so that it's not all kind of segregated in specific areas? And maybe I didn't read enough about it to understand if you're already working on that or if it doesn't work that way, but that's just my perception.
Well, I
Lee,
think
do you?
I think embedded in the zoning is if the town broadens its inclusionary zoning, especially as it relates to multifamily development, which is happening in our commercial districts who are trying to encourage mixed use. I think in that situation, a certain percentage of those units have to be affordable. So they're kind of being integrated within those mixed use developments at a certain percentage. And so that's kind of happening throughout those districts. So you're seeing that that dispersion that's kind of happening in that commercial core. In terms of the residential district, it really becomes much more difficult because of just the pricing and the value of the land. And so that becomes, I think, a little bit more difficult to accomplish it in that context. But I think commercially, with higher density residential development, with a certain percentage of it being dedicated as affordable, you'll get that dispersion more universally across those districts.
Thank you.
All right, hands have switched. I'm looking, it looks like Matt has a hand up now.
Sure. Just Marianne, to your point about in Lee incorporating houses, and Natasha about, it's right now in certain areas, but how do we get it back in this area? And I think, Marianne, we were talking about general residence. So you're thinking about like Oak Street and Maple Street, and then parts of Honeywell. If you pull out your zoning map, it's the yellow area. And right now, as of right, you can have a 2-family house on a plot. If you're
And
able
all
to,
the houses on Dale down
right,
towards the
exactly.
side.
There's another one,
Yep.
exactly. So you can look at it, but if you were able to do something like 4 units, or one would have to be affordable, or whatever the math was, and then even if it's rental, or then you get into the idea of ownership, it would allow that type of idea to come forward. So I think that's a smart idea to look at those areas. And I also know if you look at the general residence area, they stop at certain points. I think if you're going down Honeywell, for example, it's like one area and then it stops. So I think if we looked around those, and I know the planning board's doing this, but if you look around those areas, you can then say, okay, we can expand this and that makes sense. But I think you really have to incentivize more units on a parcel by making some affordable. And whatever that affordable is, we have to talk about it.
So Natasha, I think if you actually look at the town map, you'll find multifamily housing, at least in terms of 2 families. And the question is, could it be more dense? Spread really across a number of parts of town. And we have seen developers who acquire property in general residence areas building single homes. When they build back, they build them as multifamily. So that has been happening in town for a number of years.
Yeah, I need to look at that. I need to look at the map just to orient myself.
Yeah. Other questions related to this? Karen, you didn't really talk about oh, Jay, I'll let you go.
Sure, sorry. Karen and Lee, this is probably a more difficult question for you, but you were with us, I think, for most of the vision discussion. I'd be very interested in your comments as we talk about racial equity and understanding that you can't use race as a lens for, describing housing. What would you set out as your goals for creating more equity and more of the lines of having mixed income and not, housing complexes or projects or things like that? How do we integrate it to what we have as opposed to building siloed infrastructure?
I think you kind of build on what was already kind of discussed here, which is that if you're looking at doing mixed use development across our commercial districts close to transit, that you're building in affordable units within those projects. And that if you're looking at redevelopment within these general residence districts, which are in some instances relatively close to transit, you're doing it with a certain percentage of those units being affordable and creating that broader opportunity across income classes, by offering that option. Karen, I guess I'll see if there's anything else that you want to offer.
Yeah, I think the greatest opportunities, as Lee mentioned, in town is actually redevelopment in areas where it makes sense to have some greater density and mixed uses. And that's where I think the kind of new opportunities will actually come. Some communities have large amounts of town-owned and land, and they are able to designate them as affordable housing, go through an RFP process, and have some significant kinds of results. But the town doesn't really have much, if any, town-owned property that would be suitable. I mean, the Needham Housing Authority plans, we've been working with them for a long time, and I think there are some real opportunities there to expand the inventory and to improve it. It really does need some, capital and injections in order to kind of bring it up to standard.
So I want to put another layer on this, because I do think that redevelopment is a major opportunity, but redevelopment is something that happens in phases. And it usually gets greenlit in phases because we're trying to balance other things as well. So for example, right, we have some fairly good experience at this point about, as we add new rental units or as we add new units, how many children will result from those particular units. So we've gained experience, we have some idea, but that's something that we continue to watch very carefully, because we have elementary schools that are completely full. And if we were to add a significant number of units and it meant we had to build a new school, that triggers a $60–70 million bill for the taxpayer, then you're balancing that. And similarly, because the elementary schools are completely full, we know that we're planning to rebuild the middle school. But if you have to build it significantly larger, there's an increment there. And we know we have a high school that's tight. So all of this is part of the balance, because you don't want to trigger, multi-$100 million tax bills to build new schools. at the same time. So it's a balancing act. Marcus.
I know you just spoke about kind of getting things up to standard. You talked about, building new and then, fixing old, needing capital and whatnot. What is happening to the families, or what would happen to families that are there in those apartments and housing that need the work and that need those things? How would that work for them? Would they stay there throughout the process, or they would be moved somewhere else? I think just talking to some of the families that are there now, and you talked about kind of upgrading, and I think it's probably long overdue from some of the housing units that are there, that the families are kind of going through what's going on inside of their housing. So what does it look like for them, along with making new or bringing that up to standard that I think some of them so desperately need?
Yeah, that's an important question. And the housing authority would not be allowed to displace anybody. They'd have to come up with a relocation plan. It really made sense, and they would be doing things probably in some phases. But there would be no displacement.
But it could involve a couple of moves, for example.
Oh, yeah.
To create space, rebuild it, move back in, all of that as a process.
It all have to be written in a plan and approved by the state, and whatever. It'd have to.
And that wouldn't be the burden
thought out very clearly.
Yeah, that wouldn't be the burden of the families to pay for any of, like, if they're getting relocated, that wouldn't be on them to pay for that, right? Like moving costs and things like that, or it would be on them?
My understanding is that they would not have to pay, that would be part of the project costs. Any relocation would go into the project budget.
Marianne?
Yeah, Matt?
Can you just briefly talk about Section 8 vouchers? I know you brought it up earlier, and I think they can give someone an opportunity to rent, a market priced unit by getting a voucher from the housing authority. Is that correct? And that can give people opportunities, or do you see that as an opportunity?
Those vouchers are like gold. There
Okay.
are thousands of people on the wait list for vouchers. And that's the problem, just there's not enough of them. The other issue is that they have to find units within certain, maximum rents. And given housing prices in Needham, it becomes more and more challenging for voucher holders to actually find rents that qualify under the HUD limits. The Dedham Housing Authority actually administers the vouchers for folks in Needham. But I mean, there are some opportunities, but it is very challenging.
Thank you.
Karen, do you know what the wait list, how long it is? Like I work with a lot of people coming out of Boston, and the wait can be like 10 years.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So 10 years is what it's about, is what you're saying, is it could be that long. And
there are some preferences and priorities for certain people, and it's at this point it's kind of a centralized wait list, and
Even priority though, it can be like.
Yeah, I am not a Section 8 expert, but I try to track how many people on wait list. At one point, it was 45,000. Then I heard even higher. This is statewide. I mean, it's just if you can get a Section 8 voucher, it's a real coup. It's not that it doesn't happen, but it is challenging.
So why still add more people to the wait list? I'm just trying to understand, if we keep growing and growing, it just becomes longer and longer, then what's happening or not happening?
Some people who have been on the wait list for a long time have found housing, and they don't need, it does kind of, the list does turn over,
And people's circumstances change across those 10 years as well. But you're right, the net effect is that it's such a long list as to not be practical.
It's really sad.
Okay. Vivian?
I know one of the issues that I guess I'm curious, Lee and Karen, how you handle this situation where, there's a desire to provide affordable housing for, people to come into town. But there's also, you read in the news and you read and hear from current residents of the town about affordable housing for the elderly. And so what do you do in terms of balancing, what could seemingly be competing concerns and yet is still a concern about making housing affordable for the population?
Well, if it's not senior house, it's not public housing. Part of the problem with seniors who, if someone owns their house and wants to downsize, chances are that they have too much equity in their house to qualify for affordable housing based on that 80% of area median income, even if they meet that income, because there's a limit on financial assets. So it just means that you could still provide that housing. You might not just be able to qualify those people and those units as part of the subsidized housing inventory. And there is some justification for providing housing for people who are above the 80% of area median income level, but are still priced out of the housing market here, way priced out still. Equity does play a role in what people can afford. If there's some subsidies in the units for seniors, then that might open up some opportunities for more affordable condos for seniors looking to downsize who would not meet the state affordability requirements. Did I confuse people?
Well, I'm just concerned about the competing interests that can come into play, which can create areas of division, if you will, amongst different aspects of our groups in our community. And I sit there and I think about, for example, those seniors who can no longer afford to pay their taxes and they may have liens on their property. And so they end up having to sell their property to a developer. And I'm wondering if there, what possibilities exist for, the town to perhaps be engaged in incentivizing developers to develop affordable housing in those situations. And I know some of it goes to zoning. There's no question about that.
So I do hope that that's something that the planning board will take up and consider whether there's some change to our zoning that lets, where we've had the ability to move to a 2-family. Maybe we think about, are there places that could be 3 or 4 depending on the size of the property? How does that work in more places?
Harriet, maybe Lee could talk about the Carter Mill project, which is aimed at seniors and does have an affordable component.
Yes,
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's a project that I anticipate is probably going to go through the planning board in terms of probably permitting within the next 2 months. And so it has an independent living component, it has an assisted living component, it has a memory unit component, and it has a requirement that 12.5% of the units be affordable, and they will be available then for seniors. So that's a project that is probably going to go forward within the next 1.5 years and will offer those opportunities to Needham seniors.
Katie?
Lee, could you also just speak to ADUs, accessory dwelling units, briefly?
Oh, sure. Needham has a provision for accessory dwelling units. It was adopted about a year ago, and we're seeing quite quite a bit of interest. Actually, the ZBA is probably processing one accessory dwelling unit per month, sometimes two at their meetings. These were units, though, that were really kind of designed for family members or for caregivers living in those units. And so I think there might be an opportunity to look at expanding that definition to make those accessory dwelling units maybe available on a rental basis to low-income residents. Initially, I think when we implemented this, there was concern about the extent that that provision would be utilized. And so I think we're seeing that it's probably about 12 to 18 units being created per year. And it's always, and because it's focused really around family members and caregivers, it limits it. And we had originally talked about allowing those units to be rented out and as small units to folks that were not related to the primary property owner. And that might be something that the planning board wants to re-look at in terms of expanding that opportunity so we capture a larger market.
So there's pieces to consider. I hope you have a sense so that there's a lot of moving parts. So just talking about housing, there's a lot of different parts of the housing question, even in Needham. And I do think that the document that Karen and Lee prepared does a good job of laying out those different components with what could be done, as well as programs that the town has put in trying to help people either stay in homes or, for our existing renters, to keep seniors in homes, those pieces as well, and keep them repaired.
I think, Marianne, one thing we didn't touch on in great detail was the whole idea of inclusionary zoning. And Needham has inclusionary zoning embedded in its regulatory framework for a number of its zoning districts, although in some instances it doesn't have those provisions. And I think one thing to really maybe be looking at is expanding that, and actually I think revisiting what the rules should be to promote inclusionary zoning. I mean, we have certain standards that we've adopted historically, but I think this might be a good opportunity to look at what should those rules be and how should they be applied across districts to create a consistent regulatory framework.
Can you define inclusionary zoning?
I think this was basically a provision that required in the situations where you were building, we'll say multiple family dwelling units, where a certain percentage of those units had to be designated as being affordable within certain classes of affordability. And so different communities, I mean, Needham has some areas of town where the standard is set at 10%, other areas where it's set at 12.5%. And then there are communities that have much higher standards in the Boston area. So I think it's an opportunity for Needham to kind of look at its regulatory framework, look at what other communities are doing, and assess whether or not Needham wants to modify the rules and kind of create a uniform platform across the community.
So one of the other areas that I think we'll be looking at, Jay, is we look at this redo of the 40B regulations that we have in town. We had a set of preference guidelines that included priority preference for people who lived in Needham to have access to those, or who had a connection to Needham. And so one of the reasons that we did that originally was, again, thinking if there was somebody in the community who wanted to stay in the community, that they could have access to that affordable housing, that it could be housing that our teachers or our firefighters or our police officers might have access to, that kind of thing. But, I think there's discussion now about, do we just eliminate that preference so that it can be broader? And that's something that could be considered. And, that may shift who goes into those units. all of that is to say that none of them create millions of units of affordable housing in a year. So I think I can see everybody's thinking. I think see thinking hats on all of these. I would not be surprised if people have more questions afterwards. So I think to the extent that you have more questions, if you want to direct them to Katie, she can get them to Lee and Karen. Because then we can bring back sort of, you know, an FAQ that's come from questions from the group and have those to further inform our discussion here. But I think we'll come back to this cycle when we look at goals and talk about what some priorities might be based on what you've heard and what you really hope will happen. There are efforts that are underway on the select board now to go and revisit the 40B guidelines and to update those now that we have met the initial 10%. And I know that the planning board will also be taking up this question that has been raised by the state related to housing, multifamily housing, creating a transit-oriented district around a train station or stations in some way. And so that will be a piece that they'll be looking at in the upcoming year. So those are two knowns that will be ongoing work.
Can I just mention something else? The town is part of a consortium of communities, 13 communities in the Metro West area that has access to federal home program dollars. Part of participating in the home consortium is also participating in the implementation of what's called an analysis of impediments. It's basically a regional fair housing plan. The consortium has gone through a period of looking at the plan and working with a consultant. We don't have the final draft yet, but there are going to be some opportunities to really revisit fair housing issues and expand on opportunities to promote greater fair and equal access to housing in Needham. So stay tuned on that.
Well, I think our goal is to use all of the various tools that we have at our disposal to continue to make headway on this issue. So, all right. It is 8:07 or something like that. 8:06 as I'm looking at my clock. We have engaged for another 2 hours here this evening. And I hope that everybody feels that they at least have an increased level of understanding of some of the efforts that are going on with respect to housing in the town, so we can come back and talk to this. Looking forward on our agenda, our next meeting really is focused around town staff and the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. The schools have also reached back to me and said that they have gotten some data around the Metro West survey that includes some breakouts by racial makeup. They've told me that in many cases, a lot of that data isn't able to be released because the numbers are so small, but there are some additional conclusions that they can come and share with that lens that we asked for. So it's possible that they may be able to share something that could also be incorporated in our next meeting. Lisa will be sending out the link to the page that kind of lets us all take a look at where we settled tonight. And then we'll have to figure out how we're going to come back to look at the guiding principles and to see where we can wrap those up and hopefully move some more of those forward, because I'm thinking, all right, we made progress on several of them. We didn't vote any tonight. I'm hoping that we can vote when we get one with all of its different pieces finished, if that's where we're going to end up. So I guess I'll just say, does that make sense to people as a way to go forward?
Yep.
Okay. Any other closing thoughts from people for what you heard tonight? Natasha, are you thinking of something?
Well, I just wanted to thank Lee and Kara for putting this executive summary, and like this information in one location, which is really helpful. There's just a lot of information, so I think we just need to process. But I think it's encouraging to hear that you've been thinking about it and that there are opportunities, how they germinate and continue to move forward, and how this group affects it will be interesting to see. But I think it's encouraging that it's hopefully moving in the right direction.
Well, and I
I
think,
just wanted to thank you and Ramin for the work that you did to prepare for the discussion we had about the guiding principles. And yes, thank you to Lee and Karen for the report. It's extraordinarily comprehensive. And I hope that to some degree it reaches out to the public. I think the challenge is that, we spend such intense time together, and it's always respectful dialogue, even where we're not agreeing. And I'm not sure that necessarily comes across to the community, because people get their sound bites, if they pop into part of the meeting, or they hear about it from one of us, or they see the story in the paper. But everybody's contributed so much, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
thank you, Vivian.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
all right. Well, I will say thank you again to Lee and Karen, and I would welcome a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
And a second. All right, I'm going to call names, top to bottom on my list today. Matt,
Yes.
Sue,
Yes.
Jen,
Yes.
Marcus,
Yes.
Jay,
Yes.
Ramin,
Yes.
Vivian,
Yes.
Natasha,
Yes.
Toyin,
Yes.
and Miriam votes yes. So we are adjourned. Thank you all. We
Good
will
night,
see you
all.
on
Thank
March
you.
Thank
8th.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.